This is where it all starts, at least with the US dollar, that is. Most of us are familiar with the use of the US dollar, yet for the majority of us, that is where the understanding ends, especially when it pertains to the important attributes of this paper currency, and more importantly, the consequences of its use and acceptance. The consequences that are about to be revealed also apply to other fiat currencies throughout the world. It is not limited to the United States. In order to understand the implications of such a currency, it is simpler to address the US dollar overall, since the US dollar contains the evidence of the deceptive tactics that, to this day, affects us all. To begin, we must ask some essential questions about the US dollar, like, how does it come to exist? Is it money? What does today's dollar represent? And more importantly, what has the dollar become? It all starts from a little saying that goes something like this: our money used to be backed by gold and silver. To someone that is not familiar with this claim or is simply unaware of the path that the dollar has taken over the years, one may ask, is this true? Why was the money backed by gold and silver to begin with? And why was it removed? This is where our journey begins. Throughout history, gold and silver have been sought after for what had become a medium of exchange that is outside of the existing currencies of the times, like that of private bank currencies, state currencies, and even a continental currency, where it was printed "mind your business." These currencies would eventually cease altogether since the people had lost all trust in these types of currencies, resulting in all of them being outlawed years later with the passage of the Constitution for the United States. Still, just like other people around the world, Americans searched far and wide to gather as much of the precious metals as they could find. A question that arises is, why had this become an acceptable practice? It was soon realized that unlike paper currency backed by fabricated promises, gold and silver actually maintained its purchasing power and in most instances had increased in value. Even the Egyptians appreciated the intrinsic value of gold and silver. In the more modern age, during the 19th century, the people understood the importance of changing the state of their gold and silver into a more efficient means of facilitating trade. Therefore, private mints were founded, leading to the first U.S. mint being created. In exchange for their metals, the people received coins, just like today, wherein the U.S. Mint would produce a variety of coins in different weights and values, where each coin would exhibit a face value, like this gold coin displaying a $20 value. What's interesting is that the U.S. Mint is still, to this day, producing gold and silver coins with a representative face value in each coin. Some may say that this is done out of tradition while disregarding the actual purchasing power of the metals themselves. Not only are these coins marked with a face value, they are individually created and valued according to the weights and measures requisite, meaning each coin is valued by the weight of the metal contained in each coin. This also applies to the remaining denominations of the silver coins, like that of the dime, quarter, half dollar, and obviously the silver dollar. Isn't it interesting that none of the newly created coins are to be considered as money or legal tender? Yet the existing coins that may still be in circulation are to be accepted in exchange with no regard to the content of silver in the coins themselves? As for addressing the claim of tradition, the coins that we use today are similar in appearance, but that is where the similarities end. Have you ever asked why the quarter and dime have ridged edges, unlike the nickel and penny? These ridges were indeed carried over to the less valued coins of today solely from tradition. Some would say that the ridged edges on the dime assist the visually impaired by enabling them the ability to distinguish between a dime and a penny. While this is true, this was not the intent of the ridges. To confirm this, one should ask, then why do quarters have ridges? Let's find out, shall we? The ridges on the gold and silver coins were incorporated into the coins soon after the mint began to produce the different denominations of coins for one specific purpose, resulting from a particular problem identified early on. It was found that there were dishonest people filing shavings off of the edges of the gold and silver coins, whereby allowing them to pass off a coin for face value when in reality they had in fact stolen a portion of the coin's actual value, all with the intent in gathering enough material to have yet another coin. With these edges in place, anyone accepting the coin could immediately run their fingers around the coin's edge, enabling them to quickly determine that they were indeed receiving the coin's true value and weight, as it would be easy to identify any tampering of the coin. This supplied a means of assuring one's wealth from someone of questionable character. Still, it is interesting to see how the bankers skirted around the protections of having coin money like that of gold and silver. Their deception will become apparent soon enough. Once gold and silver coin had become widely accepted, the bankers somehow enticed a good portion of the American people into depositing their gold and silver into their banks, and in return, the people would receive a certificate for what they had deposited. This, however, posed one problem. The bankers had taken it upon themselves to inflate their certificates by issuing more certificates than what they had in gold and silver. Why would the bankers believe that they could get away with such a dishonest act? Well, if you think about it, who would actually know that the bankers were doing such a thing that is outside of the bankers themselves? No one would, at least until it was too late. Could this have been one of the primary reasons why President Andrew Jackson had vetoed the Bank of the United States' charter, effectively doing away with the bank entirely? Still, some would call this gold certificate $20, even though the certificate purports to pay $20. This also applies to the silver certificate, as it also is identified as a certificate on its face. Now we can see that no matter what certificates were issued by the banks, the certificates came to exist as a result of the same amount of gold and silver being deposited. That's to say that the bankers were being honest and were not, as mentioned before, creating certificates with no backing whatsoever. You will come to understand, if you don't already, why the bankers sought so desperately to issue gold and silver certificates, as the issuance of certificates were a stepping stone to a much bigger scheme. This brings us back to the current US dollar and to the next question: is it money? It is interesting how money is defined. In usual and ordinary acceptation, it means coins and paper currency used as circulating medium of exchange, and does not embrace notes, bonds, or evidence of debt. Therefore, notes, as in the US dollar, are not to be included as money, since they are a representation of debt, which we will address shortly. After taking a closer look at what we call the dollar today, it should go without saying that today's dollar is not backed by gold or silver, or anything of an intrinsic value whereby limiting its creation. Since the dollar is identified as a Federal Reserve note, we must identify what a note is. A note is an instrument containing an express and absolute promise of the signer, i.e. the maker of the note, to pay to a specific person or bearer a definite sum of money at a specific time. It is interesting to see that in the definition of a note, it states that a note purports to pay a sum of money. Okay, that's all well and good, but why isn't it money? Federal Reserve notes do not qualify as money since they do not have a store of value, meaning they do not maintain their value or gain in value, but rather decrease in value over a period of time, as all fiat currencies do over their lifetime, unlike gold and silver. It is important to recognize that money is nothing more than a substitute for barter, making the facilitation of trade more convenient. The only reason why we need money is because our society, for the most part, agrees that we need money. Money is nothing more than a measurement of wealth, effectively allowing us to store our present and past investments of wealth for future trade. True wealth is anything in demand like that of real estate, equipment, and other personal property. However, the most valued wealth includes our labor, time, and more importantly, our intelligence. Isn't it curious as to why the certificates like that of gold and silver state that they will pay the person in dollars? As we can see, gold and silver certificates were to only come into existence through the acquisition and depositing of gold and silver. Therefore, our money was never backed by gold and silver. Our money was gold and silver. Remember when it was explained that gold and silver coins were valued and sized accordingly? It is prudent to note that if you were to come across a dime, quarter, or half dollar with a date of 1964 or older, you should keep it, as those coins contain silver unlike the newer coins we are using today. The bankers knew that they had to condition the American people into believing that the Federal Reserve note was a dollar. This was accomplished by implementing their transitional-based currency from what was a commodity-based system of sound money that protected the people's wealth to that of a debt system. Let's let the dollar speak for itself. Between 1913, the year the Federal Reserve Act was passed, and the 1950s, the Federal Reserve banks issued this traditional-based currency. As you can see, this Federal Reserve note is within the 1934 series and purports to pay the bearer on demand $5. Now here's the important part, so pay close attention. Since the note states that it will pay you $5, then the note itself cannot be $5. Interestingly, even though America was still on the gold and silver standard at this time, the mention of gold and silver has conveniently been removed. The Federal Reserve notes from this time frame have the pretense to pay the bearer in dollars, while the note itself masquerades as a dollar, or in this case, $5. Yet here's another important fact, which was in plain sight during those years. It's located toward the upper left side of the note, wherein it states that this note is redeemable in lawful money at the United States Treasury or at any Federal Reserve Bank. What does this mean? Well, lawful money has always been gold or silver. That leads us to what we have today. The dollar still purports to be a Federal Reserve note, but it no longer states that it will pay you anything. The note has simply become the dollar, and by all evidence provided thus far, the claim that the Federal Reserve note is a dollar has been refuted. In order to understand the magnitude of the situation, we must understand how Federal Reserve notes come to exist. This is where it gets even more interesting. There have always been people who were outside of government wanting to take control of the country's money supply so that they could become filthy rich, while at the same time acquiring the immunity of not having to follow any type of law. These people became the bankers of the time. In 1913, those private bankers and the U.S. federal government entered into a joint venture, a cartel if you will, allowing the private bankers to once again control the nation's money supply. Don't overlook the fact that this cartel benefits both parties, and their sinister plan can only be appreciated when we evaluate the process of how Federal Reserve notes are created. In doing so, it's easier if we start at the beginning. Therefore, let's role play for a moment. I'm the Federal Reserve Bank and you are the federal government. You decide to borrow the first 10 Federal Reserve notes, and for this example, we'll call them dollars. You borrow the $10 at 10% interest for 1 year. 10% of $10 is $1. Therefore, you will owe $11 at the end of the year. If I, the Fed, have only created $10 thus far, where are you going to get the other dollar to pay me back? It's actually quite simple. It doesn't exist. And as a result, you will have to borrow another $10, and again at 10% interest. You will then have to take $1 from the second loan and add it to the payment of the first loan, leaving you with $9 remaining. When the second loan becomes due, you will be $2 short. As you can see, once the first loan is accepted, there is no way that you can repay the final loan without first going into more debt. There is no way to repay this type of loan in the same currency in which it was borrowed. This illustration demonstrates how Federal Reserve notes come to exist through debt. This, however, does not rule out the Fed's ability to create more currency at their own discretion from physically creating the paper currency or simply entering some digits into a computer. To think that these people do not create more for themselves in order to buy up the wealth around them is absurd, to say the least, especially since they have the law on their side, forcing the rest of us to play their game and to use their currency as legal tender. Due to this type of monetary system, the debt that is owed to the privately owned Federal Reserve banks becomes deeper and deeper, and is why the nation's debt started out low and began to skyrocket in the later years. Most of the American people are unaware that before the Federal Reserve Note had come to exist, our country already had a national currency, and itself was also called a note. It was called the United States Note. United States notes were issued from 1862 to 1971, starting with President Lincoln, and were issued as a direct result of the American Civil War. This allowed the government headed by President Lincoln to go beyond its means, ensuring that he and the North would be victorious in the war. Even with the victory well established, the greenback continued. Yes, the newly conceived United States note was commonly referred to as the greenback, since the back of the note had been printed with green ink. In the later years of the United States note, it too went through some changes right alongside its counterpart, the Federal Reserve Note. As with the Federal Reserve Note, the United States note also stated that it would pay the bearer in an amount of dollars. Since both of these notes clearly indicate that they were redeemable in an amount of dollars, this in itself proves that these notes cannot be a dollar themselves. For if they were, there would be no need to make such a claim, paying someone in an amount of dollars, that is. Yet this brings us to the big question. Why would the people within the U.S. federal government ever allow people outside of the government the ability to create currency for the country, let alone the ability to charge the government interest on what they had supplied to them, especially when the U.S. federal government had already been creating essentially the identical currency? And here's the important part: without owing anything to anyone, including interest. Even though there appears to be multiple reasons as to why the federal government would allow such a thing, the only important part to any of them is that it was wrong. And again, for that reason, that's why this type of currency had been outlawed. So between 1913 and the 1950s, the United States note also went through the exact same transition than that of the Federal Reserve Note. Both of these notes at one time purported to pay an amount in dollars, as previously mentioned, as opposed to masquerading as the dollar itself. The bankers knew that they had to manipulate the United States note at the same time that they were manipulating the Federal Reserve Note, as to ensure their plan would go off without a hitch and not to draw much attention to the transition itself. We can even lay out these so-called dollars so that we can see the transition clearly. The transition starts with the promise to pay in gold or silver, to a claim of making a payment in just dollars, wherein the payment of gold and silver has been removed, to just claiming to be a dollar, or in this case, $5, with no mention of any payment. You see, for over 100 years, the dishonest leaders within the Federal Reserve banks and the federal government have been getting us coming and going. They no longer have to resort to filing off the edges of gold and silver coins. All they have to do is create their own currency, loan it out, and charge interest, resulting in a fabrication of an amount of currency that never exists and cannot be paid back. They then take more of our wealth through an unjust and unwarranted tax called an income tax, and will not hesitate to use violence to ensure our compliance. If that wasn't disturbing enough, with the use of their reports like the Consumer and Producer Price Indexes, they can ensure the wealth of the American people diminishes even further through a secret tax called inflation, resulting in an increase in prices, whereby stealing our purchasing power, which is nothing more than a covert way of stealing our wealth. But it doesn't stop there. As the cost of living increases, so do sales taxes, whereby taking even more from the American people and now distributing it to the local governments. The owners of the Federal Reserve banks know that this type of debt can never be paid back in the same currency in which it was borrowed. It can, however, be paid back in something other than Federal Reserve notes, like that of gold and silver, or other assets. But this would need some discussion, since the loans that were originated by the Fed were created from nothing of value. This, of course, is the essence of their diabolical plot, taking whatever they can to ensure that the mass majority of people remain stagnant in their ability to save and are unable to pass on any substantial amount of wealth to their families, let alone dividing the families, as most people have become subjected to the despair that such a system places upon us. It's quite simple. money has the potential to divide us all. What would a person of reasonable intelligence call a system that is based off of debt, whereby requiring more and more people to go into debt and to relinquish a good portion of their wealth to a system for the purposes of just maintaining the system itself? Would one call this type of system a Ponzi scheme? Yes, they would. Yet this would be an insult to Ponzi schemes overall, as Ponzi schemes are voluntary in nature and are not backed by government force, which is the reason why this type of system has existed to this point. In all honesty, is there really any difference between these two groups of men? Not really. Oh, I forgot, there is one slight difference. The criminals on the left have somehow gained a cloak of legitimacy to their actions of theft and murder. It is interesting to know that you can buy insurance in order to protect your wealth from being stolen from the group on the right, but you cannot buy insurance in order to protect your wealth from the group on the left, as insurance companies know that betting against criminal factions, i.e. these groups of people, to do what is right is a losing proposition. Therefore, unless your head is in the sand, it is easy to see that the prominent reason why most people do not have any amount of savings to speak of is directly related to our current monetary and legal systems. It had been noted that Thomas Jefferson had warned the American people about this very situation, wherein he said, if the American people ever allowed private banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and the corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent that their fathers conquered. I believe that the banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. Are we feeling the consequences that Thomas Jefferson had warned us about? Still, some would say that today there isn't enough gold and silver to go around, and for that reason going back to a gold and silver standard would be impossible. Well, it is important to note that they have overlooked one critical aspect that refutes their argument. They are simply refusing to consider a price reduction, which will be explained in a moment. Yet some will add that the situation is more complicated. Well, remember this. Anyone who suggests that a situation is more complicated than it needs to be does so for only one of two reasons. They either truly do not understand the situation at hand, and or they are simply wanting to take advantage of you, as they are about to or have been benefiting from the situation from the beginning. This is why we should always question complicated answers. A perfect example of this is when Nancy Pelosi stated that we have to pass the bill so that you can find out what's in it. This type of stupidity and deception should not be accepted or tolerated. So, is there enough gold and silver? It really boils down to a mindset, as the only reason why such an argument would be entertained is that the persons involved have either overlooked or refused to consider the option of associating the existing level of prices to that of the face value of gold and silver, meaning that the high prices of today can be compared to the lower face value of gold and silver. Most people have a hard time grasping this concept, as there is something in our psyche making us believe that the only direction that prices can go is up. We never consider the option of reducing prices to that of the face value of gold and silver. I wonder why. If you compare the current prices to that of gold and silver, you will find that most, not all, of the goods and services have dropped in price, as you will soon see. The reason why this is not readily apparent is due to the increasing amount of Federal Reserve notes being associated to any given item or service. Hopefully this will become obvious, but we must first understand what it means to be on a gold and silver standard. What this means is that no one, not even a group of people, can arbitrarily make themselves wealthier by creating more money, as opposed to what Alan Greenspan had confirmed, that this cartel is doing exactly that, creating an unlimited amount of money to pay their debts.
The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default.
Yet some of our fellow Americans, and just about all of the people associated to the government, will say that the government needs our tax dollars. This is simply not true. nor should they be justified in the taking of someone else's property without the owner's permission or through illegitimate means like that of inflation and direct taxation. This is wrong in so many ways, yet these acts will somehow go on to be justified, lending a sense of legitimacy to their thievery. The time has come for us to change our behavior and to stop acting in the same manner as our parents and grandparents. Just because something is doesn't mean it ought to be. It is important to understand that it is the essence of a criminal act for a small group of people to come together and pass what purports to be a law granting them permission to create money out of no effort of their own, at their own discretion, and at the expense of others. This is nothing less than theft, wherein they have created a system that purposely and without the people's choice shifts the wealth from the many to the few. This needs to change, and a change can happen, but only if you become concerned. It is quite simple to see how the face value of gold and silver can once again be used versus the extraordinary amounts that we see today. In this example, we will be calculating the comparison in gold. This is where the face value of each coin comes into play. When the current price of an item is associated to the face value of gold or silver, like that of this $50 gold coin, one can begin to evaluate the item's true value. That is, if the values have not been manipulated by a third party like that of the Federal Reserve Banks. In this example, an average price for both items will be used as a base as of August 2015. Therefore, take a home that is valued at $200,000 in Federal Reserve notes, that is, and this 1 ounce gold coin valued at $1,000, also in Federal Reserve notes. In order to gain the value of the house in gold coin, all we have to do is divide the current value of the gold coin into the value of the house, and we get an answer of 200 or 200 coins, since each coin is valued at $1,000. We then take the 200 gold coins and multiply 200 by the face value of the coin itself, which is $50. We now get a house value of $10,000, or $10,000 in gold, that is. You see how $10,000 in gold can buy the same house valued at $200,000 in Federal Reserve notes? The disconnect that occurs with someone who applies that there's not enough gold or silver does so because they fail to consider lowering the amount of the cost of the item, as we would not need $200,000 in the face value of gold to buy the house. It really is simple. So long as we continue to convert our most valuable asset, our labor, into a medium of exchange that can be manipulated in a fashion that redirects our wealth to a small group of people, the human race will continue to waste resources needlessly in the attempts to regain the wealth that had been taken. Returning to sound money will reduce the need of us having to redo ourselves every day in the pursuit of more money. When we return to sound money, prices will once again begin to fall, as we will be able to store our purchasing power and wealth as opposed to losing it today. This will again lead us down a road of endless possibilities. Maybe, just maybe, we will reach a sense of maturity that will enable us to have a society without money, or at the least, a society with less of a need for money. If you claim to be a conservationist or a supporter of fairness and equality, then you must support an ethical system wherein we have the ability to store our labor and wealth without the covert threat of theft. This is why we need to end the Fed and return to a sound money like that of gold and silver, where we can store our future value.